The merciless sun beat down on Eagle Shadow Canyon, its rays reflecting off the rust-colored walls like fire from heaven. Rebecca Mitchell's parched lips cracked as she tried to swallow, the metallic taste of blood mingling with the dust that coated her tongue. Her once sturdy canvas dress hung in tatters from her frame, stained with sweat and the rusty hue of canyon soil. She stumbled forward, one hand trailing against the scorching rock face for balance, the other clutching an almost empty canteen that mocked her with each hollow slosh. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rawlins, she whispered, her voice a brittle shadow of itself. Jedediah Rawlins. Saying his name aloud was a bitter comfort, a reminder that her current hell had a human architect. 2 weeks ago, she'd been just another widow on the wagon, train, heading west toward promises of new beginnings. Now she was alone, betrayed, abandoned in the labyrinthine depths of Eagle Shadow Canyon by the very guide she'd paid to lead her to safety. Her gaze drifted upward, tracing the jagged rim of the canyon that towered impossibly high above. No rope, no path, no way out. Just the mocking cry of a circling hawk riding the thermals, waiting patiently for her inevitable surrender to the elements. "Not today," Rebecca muttered, forcing another step forward as the ground shifted beneath her worn boots. "Not like this." The sun slipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the canyon floor. Soon, the scorching heat would give way to bone-deep cold, another of the desert's cruel tricks. She needed shelter, needed water beyond the precious few swallows remaining in her canteen. As darkness began to claim the canyon, Rebecca's eyes caught something, a shadow that moved differently from the rest, more purposeful, more alive. She froze, squinting into the gathering dusk. There, perched on a rocky outcropping like he'd materialized from the stone itself, was a man. His dark hair was longer than any white man would wear it, pulled back with a strip of leather. His clothing, earth-toned and practical, blended with the canyon walls. But it was his eyes that captured her, watchful, measuring, missing nothing. A Navajo hunter, Rebecca had heard stories around campfires, tales meant to frighten and warn. But as she stood trembling from exhaustion and dehydration, fear wasn't what rose in her breast. It was hope. The wagon train had left Fort Garrison. With high hopes and higher spirits, 23 wagons strong, they'd set out for the promised lands of California, where orchards bloomed year-round and gold still glinted in stream beds. Or so the pamphlets claimed. Rebecca Mitchell had joined them 3 days after burying her. Husband Thomas, his body still warm from the fever that had ravaged him with merciless efficiency. "A woman alone has no business on the frontier," Elias Cooper, the wagon master, had told her with a frown that deepened the lines around his mouth. "You'd be better served returning east to family." But Rebecca had no family back east, no home to return to. Everything she and Thomas had owned was packed in the small wagon with the faded blue canvas cover. So she'd stood straight back before Cooper, her grief still raw, but her resolve ironclad. "I paid for passage to California, Mr. Cooper. And to California I will go." Cooper had relented, though the look he exchanged with the other men spoke volumes. A widow was a burden, an extra mouth to feed, a vulnerability in a journey already fraught with danger. She saw the calculation in their eyes. How much trouble would she be? How much value did she bring? It was Jedediah Rawlins who had approached her that evening as she sat alone by her small fire, the flames painting his gaunt face in shades of gold and shadow. "Mrs. Mitchell," he'd said, removing his wide-brimmed hat. "I couldn't help but overhear your predicament." Rebecca had studied him cautiously. Rawlins was new to the company, having joined as a guide at Fort Garrison. He claimed intimate knowledge of the territories ahead, alternate routes that would save time and avoid potential conflicts with native tribes. His clothing was trail-worn, but of good quality, and he spoke with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being believed. "I'm managing quite well, Mr. Rawlins," she'd replied, stirring the beans that would be her solitary dinner. Of course," he'd said, settling uninvited on a stump across from her, "only I thought perhaps we might help each other. This company moves like molasses in January, following the main trails where any fool with eyes could find their way. I know a faster route, through canyon country. Cuts 3 weeks off the journey." Rebecca had raised an eyebrow. "And why share this information with me?" Rawlins had smiled then, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. A guide traveling alone draws attention. A guide escorting a widow to reunite with her family in California. That's a story folks understand. We could leave tomorrow, travel light and fast. You'd be in Sacramento before the first autumn chill. It had seemed so reasonable then. She'd been desperate to escape the pitying glances, the unspoken assessment of her value diminishing with each passing day. And Rawlins had references, or so he claimed, from merchants in Fort Garrison who vouched for his knowledge of the territories. What Rebecca couldn't have known was that those references were as illusory as the mirages that danced on the horizon. She couldn't have known that Jedediah Rawlins was no guide at all, but a deserter from the cavalry with a warrant for his arrest in 3 territories. She couldn't have known that the shortcut through canyon country was meant to separate her from the safety of numbers, so he could take what little she had of value. Thomas's gold pocket watch, her wedding band, the small pouch of coins sewn into her petticoat, and the wagon and horses that represented her last chance at independence. But now, 10 days into their journey, as they descended into the twisting maze of Eagle Shadow Canyon, Rebecca began to sense that something was terribly wrong. Rawlins had grown increasingly agitated, scanning the ridgelines with nervous energy, changing their course with no explanation. The 3-day passage through the canyon had stretched to 5, then 7. Their water supplies dwindled alarmingly. "I'm not sure this is the right path, Mr. Rawlins," Rebecca had ventured on the 8th morning, watching as he paced the small clearing where they'd made camp. "Perhaps we should turn back, rejoin the main trail, and admit to Cooper that you needed saving after all." Rawlins had sneered, an ugliness seeping into his expression that she hadn't seen before. "We're too deep now, Mrs. Mitchell. Forward is the only way." That night, Rebecca had wakened to find Rawlins going through her belongings, her small trunk open beside him as he rifled through the carefully packed mementos of her former life. "What are you doing?" she'd demanded, sitting up sharply. The look he'd given her then had sent ice through her veins. A predator unmasked, calculation replaced by raw intent. "Looking for what you've been hiding," he'd said, any pretense of gentility gone from his voice. "No woman travels this far. West without insurance, gold, jewels. Where is it?" "There's nothing," Rebecca had replied, her mouth suddenly dry. "Just what you see. We lost everything in the drought before Thomas took ill." Rawlins had moved then, faster than she'd expected, his hand closing around her throat with enough pressure to make breathing difficult, but not impossible. A warning. "Don't lie to me," he'd hissed, his face inches from hers. "I've guided your kind before, always something sewn into a hem, tucked into a Bible, hidden in plain sight." Rebecca had clawed at his hand, panic rising as she struggled for air. "The watch!" she'd gasped. "Thomas's watch! Gold case, it's worth something." He'd released her then, and she'd collapsed back onto her bedroll, gasping and coughing. "Where?" With trembling hands, she'd reached beneath her pillow, withdrawing the timepiece that had been her husband's pride. The moonlight caught the engraved surface, making the elaborate TM glow like a brand. Rawlins had snatched it, turning it over in his hands before tucking it into his vest pocket. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What else? Nothing, I swear it. His eyes had narrowed, but he'd stepped back. We'll see. Get some sleep, Mrs. Mitchell. We've got ground to cover tomorrow. Rebecca hadn't slept. Instead, she'd lain awake, mind racing through limited options. She was deep in unfamiliar territory, dependent on a man who had just revealed himself as a thief at best, a murderer at worst. Running was suicide, the canyon was a maze, and without water or knowledge of the land, she'd be dead within days. Fighting was equally futile. Rawlins was armed and stronger. Her only hope was to play along until they reached somewhere, anywhere, with other people. Then she could seek help, perhaps find protection with another group of travelers. But Jedediah Rawlins had other plans. The next day, they'd traveled in tense silence deeper into the canyon network. The walls rose higher on either side, the path narrowing until the wagon barely fit through some passages. Late in the afternoon, they'd come to a small clearing, with a trickle of water seeping from the rock face. Not enough to replenish their supplies, but enough to wet their throats. "We'll camp here," Rawlins had announced, already unhitching the horses. Rebecca had moved to help, her body tense, but her expression carefully neutral. "How much farther to the canyon exit?" "Eager to be rid of me?" Rawlins had laughed, a sound without humor. 2 days, maybe 3, if we're lucky." As dusk fell, Rebecca had prepared a meager dinner from their dwindling supplies. Rawlins had watched her every move, one hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. When she'd handed him his plate, their fingers had brushed, and she'd had to fight the urge to recoil. "You know," he'd said conversationally, between mouthfuls of beans, "I've been thinking about our arrangement." Rebecca had frozen her own, food untouched. "What arrangement would that be?" "You, me, California." Rawlins had gestured vaguely westward. "Might be nice having a woman along. Someone to cook, keep things tidy." His eyes had raked over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Provide company." The implication hung in the air between them. Rebecca had set her plate down slowly, careful to keep her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her. "I have family waiting in Sacramento," she'd lied. "A brother who'll be expecting me." Rawlins had smiled, revealing teeth stained by tobacco. "No, you don't. You've got no one, Mrs. Mitchell. That's why you're perfect." That night, Rebecca had feigned sleep until Rawlins's breathing had deepened into the rhythmic pattern of slumber. Moving with agonizing slowness, she'd gathered what she could carry: a small knife from the cooking supplies, the canteen, a handful of jerky wrapped in cloth, and the matches. It wasn't much, but it might keep her alive long enough to find help, or at least die on her own terms. She'd crept toward the horses, thinking that if she could just take one, she might have a chance. But Rawlins had anticipated her. The horses were hobbled in a way that would require time and noise to undo. Time she didn't have, noise she couldn't risk. Instead, she'd slipped away on foot, following the faint trickle of water upstream, hoping it might lead to a larger source. The night was cool, the path illuminated only by starlight filtering down from the narrow strip of sky visible between canyon walls. She'd moved as quickly as she dared, putting distance between herself and the camp, choosing her footing carefully, to leave minimal tracks. She'd made it perhaps 2 miles before the canyon had split into 3 identical-looking passages. With no way to know which might lead to safety, Rebecca had chosen the one where the water trace seemed strongest, praying her instincts weren't leading her deeper into the labyrinth. By dawn, she'd been thoroughly lost, the rising sun revealing just how complex the canyon system truly was. Towering walls of striated red rock surrounded her on all sides, identical in their imposing beauty and deadly indifference to her plight. The water source she'd been following had disappeared beneath the ground, leaving only damp sand as evidence it had ever existed. Still, Rebecca had pushed on, knowing that returning to Rawlins was certain death, while forward held at least the ghost of a chance. She'd rationed the water with brutal efficiency, allowing herself only the smallest sips when dizziness threatened to overwhelm her. The day had passed in a haze of heat and exertion, the canyon seeming to deliberately mislead her at every turn. Passages that appeared promising would end in sheer rock faces. Others would circle back on themselves, bringing her to places she was certain she'd already passed. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the canyon into an oven that pulled moisture from her body faster than she could afford to replace it. By the second day, hallucinations had begun to shimmer at the edges of her vision. Thomas walking beside her, commenting on the peculiar beauty of the rock formations. Her childhood home, in Pennsylvania, somehow transported to the canyon floor. A dinner table set with crystal and china, laden with food just beyond her reach. Rebecca had known enough about desert survival, from stories if not experience, to recognize the danger signs. Without water, she had perhaps one more day before her body would shut down. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her tongue swollen, her skin hot to the touch, despite seeking shade whenever possible. It was during her third day alone in the canyon that Rebecca had heard the sound, hoofbeats echoing off the stone walls. For a moment, hope had flared in her chest. Travelers, perhaps. Rescue. But the figure that had appeared around the bend, sitting tall in the saddle of Rebecca's own horse, had extinguished that hope like water on flame. Jedediah Rawlins had found her. He dismounted slowly, eyeing her, with something between amusement and annoyance. "You're more trouble than you're worth, Mrs. Mitchell." Rebecca had backed away, the small knife clutched in her hand, though they both knew it was a futile gesture. "Stay back," she'd warned, her voice barely a rasp. Rawlins had laughed. "Or what? You'll bleed on me? Look at you. You can barely stand." It was true. 3 days with minimal water had left Rebecca weakened, her limbs heavy and uncooperative. But desperation lent her strength she didn't know she possessed. "I won't go with you," she'd said, raising the knife higher. "No," Rawlins had agreed easily. "You won't." The blow had come before she could react, a backhand that had sent her sprawling into the dust, the knife skittering from her grasp. Rebecca had tasted blood, felt the world spin as she tried to push herself upright. Rawlins had stood over her, blocking the sun. "I gave you a chance, you know. Could have been easy, but you just had to run." He'd crouched beside her then, rifling through her pockets until he'd found what he was looking for, the small pouch of coins she'd sewn into her petticoat and cut free during her escape. He'd weighed it in his hand, disappointment evident in his expression. This is what you were hiding, barely worth the trouble of tracking you." He'd tucked the pouch away regardless. "What else?" "Nothing," Rebecca had gasped, one hand pressed to her bruised cheek. "There's nothing else." Rawlins had studied her for a long moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "I believe you." He'd stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "Which means you're no longer worth my time." He'd mounted her horse, gathering the reins as he'd looked down at her prone form. "The canyon plays tricks, Mrs. Mitchell. Sound echoes, paths circle. You're already lost. Another day, maybe 2, and the vultures will have you, quicker than you deserve, honestly." Rebecca had pushed herself to her knees, defiance overriding pain. "You won't get away with this." "I already have," Rawlins had replied, his voice distant as if she were already a memory. "Good luck finding your way out. Nobody ever does." With that, he'd turned the horse and ridden away, taking with him Rebecca's last connection to civilization, her last remaining possessions, and what had seemed like her last hope of survival. She'd struggled to her feet, watching until horse and rider disappeared around a bend in the canyon. Then, with nothing left but stubborn determination, Rebecca Mitchell had continued her journey into the unknown depths of Eagle Shadow Canyon, each step a victory against the elements and the man who had left her to die. That had been yesterday, or perhaps the day before. Time had begun to blur at the edges as dehydration claimed more of her clarity. She'd walked until she couldn't, then rested in whatever scraps of shade she could find, then forced herself forward again when the ground grew too hot to remain still. The canteen was nearly empty now. Rebecca tipped it carefully, allowing herself the smallest sip, just enough to moisten her cracked lips. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most precious thing in her world. And that was how the Navajo hunter found her, a solitary figure in a torn dress, clutching an almost empty canteen, determination etched into every line of her dust-covered face. The man hadn't moved from his perch on the rocky outcropping, watching her with the stillness of one accustomed to patience. Rebecca tried to call out, but her voice failed her, producing only a cracked whisper. She took a stumbling step forward, then another, her vision beginning to tunnel. The canyon floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Rebecca reached out, trying to steady herself against a boulder, but her hand found only air. As consciousness began to slip away, the last thing she saw was the hunter moving toward her, his movements fluid and purposeful against the darkening sky. Then there was nothing but blessed darkness and the sensation of falling into the unknown depths that awaited her. Rebecca awakened to the scent of smoke and herbs, unfamiliar yet somehow comforting. Her body felt impossibly heavy, as if the very earth itself was pressing down upon her. She attempted to open her eyes, but even that small effort seemed beyond her strength. Somewhere nearby, water dripped steadily onto stone, the rhythm as regular as a heartbeat. She drifted, suspended between consciousness and oblivion, aware only of sensations, rough fabric beneath her fingertips, a cool cloth on her forehead, the distant murmur of voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. Time lost all meaning. Rebecca floated through darkness, punctuated by brief moments of confused awareness. Sometimes she thought she felt hands supporting her head, tipping water between her parched lips. Other times she was certain she was still in the canyon, the sun beating down mercilessly, vultures circling overhead. When she finally fought her way to full consciousness, the world resolved itself slowly, like a photograph emerging in developing solution. She was lying on a pallet of woven blankets inside a circular dwelling. The walls curved upward to meet at a smoke hole in the center of the ceiling, through which a patch of startlingly blue sky was visible. A small fire burned in a central pit, tendrils of fragrant smoke rising lazily toward the opening above. Rebecca tried to push herself upright, only to fall back as weakness overwhelmed her. The movement must have alerted someone, for suddenly a shadow fell across her. She turned her head, blinking to bring the figure into focus. It was him, the hunter from the canyon. Up close, she could see that his face was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 years at most, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that studied her with intense focus. He wore a simple cotton shirt and deerskin trousers, practical clothing that spoke of life lived close to the elements. "Water," Rebecca whispered, the words scraping painfully across her throat. Without speaking, he reached for a clay vessel beside the pallet, supporting her head with one hand while bringing the container to her lips with the other. The water was cool and sweet, nothing like the metallic-tasting dregs from her canteen. Rebecca drank greedily until he pulled the vessel away, shaking his head slightly. "Slowly," he said, the English word accented but clear. "Too much, you sick." Rebecca sank back onto the pallet, studying him warily. "Where am I?" "Tseyi," he replied, then seemed to reconsider. "My people's home." "How long?" she managed, gesturing weakly at herself and the dwelling. He held up 3 fingers. 3 suns. 3 days. Rebecca had been unconscious for 3 days. The realization sent a chill through her despite the warmth of the fire. She had been completely at the mercy of strangers. Strangers from a people she'd been taught to fear and distrust. Yet she was alive, had been cared for, given water and shelter. "You saved me," she said, the words half statement, half question. The man nodded once, his expression unchanged. "I am Nakohe." "Rebecca Mitchell," she replied automatically, social conventions asserting themselves even here, in a place so removed from the world she knew. Nakohe studied her for a moment longer, then rose in a fluid movement. "Rest. Heal." He gestured toward the water vessel he'd left within her reach. "I return when sun low." Before she could thank him or ask any of the 1,000 questions crowding her mind, he slipped through the dwelling's entrance, leaving her alone with the crackling fire and her tumultuous thoughts. Rest seemed impossible, despite her body's weakness. Rebecca's mind raced, trying to make sense of her situation. She was in a Navajo settlement, miles from any white settlement, dependent on the mercy of people she knew almost nothing about. Rawlins was gone with everything she owned. Her horse, her wagon, her husband's watch, even the small amount of money that represented her entire worldly worth. She was, in every meaningful way, destitute. The thought should have terrified her, yet Rebecca found herself strangely calm. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion, or perhaps it was the recognition that terror served no purpose. She was alive when by all rights she should be dead, her bones bleaching in the merciless sun of Eagle Shadow Canyon. Everything beyond that simple fact was a gift she hadn't earned. With that realization providing an unexpected anchor, Rebecca allowed her eyes to close, surrendering to the healing power of sleep. When she next awoke, the quality of light had changed. The blue patch visible through the smoke hole had deepened to indigo, and the fire had been built up to fight the chill that came with desert nightfall. Rebecca found she could push herself into a sitting position, though the effort left her dizzy and breathless. The dwelling's entrance darkened as someone stepped through. Not Nakohe this time, but a woman perhaps a few years older than Rebecca herself. She carried a wooden bowl from which steam rose in fragrant curls. Her black hair was pulled back from her face, revealing striking features set in an expression of careful neutrality. The woman approached, kneeling gracefully beside the pallet. Without speaking, she offered the bowl. Rebecca accepted it, inhaling the unfamiliar but enticing aroma, some kind of stew thick with vegetables and small pieces of meat. Her stomach clenched painfully, reminding her how long it had been since she'd eaten properly. "Thank you," she said, meeting the woman's gaze directly. Something flickered in the woman's dark eyes, surprise perhaps at being addressed as an equal. She inclined her head slightly, then spoke in accented but understandable English. "You eat, need strength." Rebecca dipped the wooden spoon provided into the stew, bringing it cautiously to her lips. The flavors exploded across her tongue, rich, savory, with herbs she couldn't identify but immediately appreciated. She ate slowly, mindful of her shrunken stomach and the watching presence of the woman. "Are you Nakohe's wife?" Rebecca asked between careful spoonfuls. The woman's expression shifted to something like disdain, though whether at the question itself or the assumption behind it, Rebecca couldn't tell. "Sister," she corrected. "I am Makawi." Rebecca nodded, feeling heat rise in her cheeks at the misstep. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." Makawi watched her eat for several more moments before speaking again. "Why you alone in Canyon? Where your people?" The question hit like a physical blow. Rebecca's hand trembled slightly as she lowered the spoon. How to explain Rawlins's betrayal, the wagon train's indifference, Thomas's death, all the cascading losses that had led her to this moment? "My husband died," she began, finding that the simplest truth was the easiest to share. "I was traveling west with others, but my guide, He left me in the canyon. Took everything I had. Makawi's expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested she was weighing Rebecca's words, testing them for truth. "White man leave white woman to die," she said finally, a statement rather than a question. "Yes," Makawi nodded as if this confirmed something she already knew. "Eat, then sleep." She rose in a single graceful movement, regarding Rebecca with those penetrating dark eyes. "Tomorrow, many questions." After Makawi left, Rebecca finished as much of the stew as her shrunken stomach could tolerate, then carefully set the bowl aside. She felt stronger, though still desperately weak. The simple act of eating had drained what little energy she had regained. As she settled back onto the pallet, pulling the woven blanket up against the growing chill, Rebecca found herself facing questions she had no answers for. What would happen to her now? Would the Navajo expect her to leave once she regained her strength? Where would she go, with no supplies, no money, no transportation? The wilderness stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. The nearest white settlement could be days away, a journey impossible to survive on foot without proper provisions. Even if she somehow made it, what awaited her there? As a woman alone, her options were severely limited. Marriage to a stranger or domestic service were the likeliest outcomes, neither offering the independence she'd dreamed of when setting out for California. For now, at least, she had shelter, food, and a tentative safety she hadn't expected to find. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, she would rest in the strange security of this dwelling, grateful for each breath that filled her lungs. The next morning brought clarity of a different kind. Rebecca awoke to find sunlight streaming through the smoke hole, illuminating the interior of the dwelling in a way that allowed her to appreciate details previously hidden in shadow. The structure itself was impressive, a domed framework of carefully joined timber covered with mud plaster and bark, creating a space that held heat efficiently while allowing smoke to escape. The floor was packed earth, swept clean and partially, covered with woven mats. Along one wall stood several clay vessels of varying sizes, some decorated with geometric patterns. A bundle of herbs hung from one of the support beams, filling the air with a subtle, pleasant fragrance. Everything spoke of skilled craftwork and careful attention to practical needs. Rebecca was contemplating these observations when the entrance darkened once more. This time, it was Nakohe who entered, carrying a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. He acknowledged her with a nod before settling cross-legged beside the fire pit, which had burned down to glowing embers. "You better," he said, his dark eyes assessing her condition. It wasn't a question, but Rebecca answered anyway. "Yes, thank you for saving my life." Nakohe's expression remained impassive. "Why white woman walk alone in canyon?" Rebecca hesitated, uncertain how much to share, how much he would understand or care about. In the end, she opted for the same simple truth she'd given Makawi. "I trusted someone I shouldn't have. He took everything and left me to die." Nakohe studied her for a long moment. "This man, guide." Rebecca blinked in surprise. "Yes. How did you know?" "Tracks tell story. 2 horses, one carrying more weight. Signs of camp." He gestured vaguely in the direction of the canyon. "You followed. Water path. Smart, but water goes underground." The matter-of-fact assessment of her situation, stripped of emotion or judgment, was strangely comforting. Here was someone who understood the physical reality of the desert, who had read the evidence of her desperate journey in the dust and stone. "His name is Jedediah Rawlins," Rebecca said, surprised at the steadiness of her own voice. "He posed as a guide to separate me from the wagon train. He wanted what little I had of value." Nakohe nodded, seemingly unsurprised by this revelation. "Bilagana like this come often, take what not theirs." Rebecca knew enough to recognize the Navajo word for white person and felt a flush of shame at being associated with men like Rawlins. "Not all white people are like that," she said, though the defense sounded hollow even to her own ears. Nakohe's expression didn't change, but something like dark amusement flickered in his eyes. No, some worse. The blunt assessment silenced her. Rebecca looked down at her hands, noting the new calluses that had formed during her journey west. The dirt still embedded beneath her nails, despite someone's attempts to clean them while she was unconscious. She was not the same woman who had left Pennsylvania months ago, soft-handed and naive. "Why did you save me?" she asked finally, raising her eyes to meet his. Nakohe considered the question with the same deliberation he seemed to bring to everything. "You fought to live," he said simply. "Fighting spirit deserves respect." Before Rebecca could respond to this unexpected answer, he unwrapped the deerskin bundle, revealing a pair of moccasins, a simple deerskin dress, and a small pouch. "Your shoes broken," he said, indicating the moccasins. "Clothes torn. These will fit." Rebecca stared at the offerings, her throat tightening with unexpected emotion. The items represented not just practical necessities, but a kind of acceptance she hadn't anticipated. "I can't repay you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nakohe's brow furrowed slightly. "No payment. You need, we have." The simplicity of the statement struck Rebecca with the force of revelation. In the world she'd left behind, every interaction carried expectations, every kindness anticipated reciprocation. Here, need itself was sufficient reason for giving. She reached out, running her fingers over the soft deerskin of the dress. The workmanship was exquisite, tiny, even stitches joining the pieces, subtle beadwork adorning the yoke. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "Thank you." Nakohe nodded, then rose to his feet in that fluid movement that made Rebecca acutely aware of her own awkwardness. "Rest today. Tomorrow, if strong enough, you come outside." With that, he was gone, leaving Rebecca to contemplate the new garments and the implied promise of continued sanctuary. Later that day, Makawi returned, bringing more food and a small clay cup filled with a bitter-tasting tea that she insisted Rebecca drink. Despite the unpleasant flavor, Rebecca complied, recognizing the medicinal nature of the brew. Afterward, Makawi helped her change into the deerskin dress, her efficient movements neither overly familiar nor coldly clinical, simply practical. The dress fit well enough, though it was clearly made for someone with a fuller figure. The soft hide felt strange against Rebecca's skin after years of cotton and wool, but the comfort was undeniable. "Pretty," Makawi commented, adjusting the beaded yoke. Her tone held a note of surprise, as if she hadn't expected the garment to suit a white woman. "Who made it?" Rebecca asked, running her fingers over the intricate beadwork. "My mother, many seasons ago." Makawi's expression softened slightly. "She walks with ancestors now." "I'm sorry for your loss," Rebecca said automatically, then wondered if such expressions of sympathy held the same meaning here. Makawi simply nodded, then gestured for Rebecca to sit. With practiced movements, she began combing through Rebecca's tangled hair, working through the knots with patient persistence. "Why you travel west?" she asked as she worked. "Why not stay with your people?" The question penetrated deeper than Makawi could know. Rebecca closed her eyes, feeling the gentle tug of the comb against her scalp. "After my husband died, there was nothing left for me in the East. No family, no home." She hesitated, then added with quiet honesty, "I thought California would offer a new beginning." Makawi's hands paused briefly before resuming their steady rhythm. "New beginning," she repeated, as if testing the concept. "This what white women want?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "Some do. Most want what women have always Wanted, safety, a home, children, enough to eat. She sighed softly. But for a woman alone, those things are hard to secure. Here also, Makawi said, surprising Rebecca with this admission of shared experience. Woman alone, vulnerable, needs family, clan. There was something in her tone that suggested personal knowledge of this vulnerability, though Rebecca didn't dare ask directly. Instead, she ventured, "Is that why you live with your brother?" Makawi's hands stilled again. Nakohe is good brother, strong hunter, respected by others. She resumed braiding Rebecca's now detangled hair. "My husband died in raid 3 summers past. No children. Nakohe said come home." The simple statement of loss and subsequent protection touched Rebecca deeply. Despite the vast differences in their cultures, some experiences transcended those boundaries. Grief, vulnerability, the need for connection. "I'm sorry about your husband," she said softly. Makawi tied off the braid with a strip of leather before responding. "Life continues. Must be strong." She moved around to face Rebecca, studying her with those penetrating dark eyes. "You also must be strong now." It wasn't advice or encouragement. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of the harsh reality they both understood. Rebecca nodded, accepting the truth of it. "I'm trying," she said. For the first time, something like approval flickered across Makawi's face. "Good. Tomorrow you come outside. Begin to learn." "Learn what?" Rebecca asked, a flutter of anxiety mixing with cautious hope. "How to live," Makawi replied simply, gathering her things before rising. "Rest now. Tomorrow comes early." True. To her word, Makawi appeared at dawn the following day, rousing Rebecca from sleep with a gentle but insistent hand on her shoulder. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, the air crisp with the promise of heat to come. "Come," Makawi said, offering a hand to help Rebecca rise. First water, then food. Rebecca's legs trembled beneath her, weak from days of inactivity and her ordeal in the canyon, but she found she could stand and walk with care. Makawi led her from the dwelling into the cool morning air, one hand remaining supportively under Rebecca's elbow. The Navajo settlement of Tseyi revealed itself in the growing light, a collection of perhaps 20 structures similar to the one Rebecca had been sheltered in, arranged in a loose circle around a central open space. Some were larger than others, clearly designed to house extended families. Smoke rose from several, carrying the scent of cooking fires. People were already moving about despite the early hour, women carrying water vessels, men preparing for the day's hunting or other tasks. Children darted between dwellings, their voices bright in the morning quiet. Activity paused as Rebecca emerged. Every eye turned toward her, expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. She felt the weight of their collective gaze, understanding instinctively that her presence represented something unexpected and potentially disruptive to their community. Makawi seemed unconcerned by the attention, continuing to guide Rebecca toward the edge of the settlement, where a clear stream bubbled over smooth stones. Other women were already there, filling containers or washing clothes. They moved aside as Makawi approached, creating a small space for Rebecca to kneel beside the water. "Wash," Makawi instructed, handing her a small piece of yucca root. "Like soap." Rebecca followed her example, dipping the root in water and rubbing it between her palms until it produced a lather. The sensation of cool water on her face and hands was blissful after days of fever and confinement. She washed thoroughly, aware of the watching women, but determined not to show discomfort under their scrutiny. When she finished, Makawi handed her a cloth to dry with, then led her to where several women were preparing the morning meal. A large pot hung over a communal fire, filled with a porridge-like mixture that smelled of corn and herbs. An older woman served portions into small clay bowls. her weathered face impassive as she handed one to Rebecca. The message was clear. She would be fed, but acceptance was another matter entirely. Rebecca murmured thanks, cradling the warm bowl in her hands as Makawi directed her to sit on a log at the edge of the gathering. The other women kept a noticeable distance, conversing quietly in their own language, occasionally glancing in Rebecca's direction. "They afraid?" Rebecca asked softly, keeping her eyes on her food. Makawi considered the question before answering. "Cautious. White people bring trouble. Disease, soldiers, broken promises." Rebecca couldn't argue with this assessment. She'd heard enough stories from settlers about conflicts with native tribes to understand that from the Navajo perspective, every white face represented potential threat. "I won't bring trouble," she said, though she knew such promises meant little. Makawi's expression remained neutral. "We will see." They ate in silence for several minutes, Rebecca savoring the simple but nourishing porridge. It was different from any breakfast she'd had before, coarser in texture, flavored with unfamiliar spices, but satisfying in a fundamental way. As the sun climbed higher, activity in the settlement increased. Rebecca observed children being assigned tasks, women organizing into work groups, men gathering hunting gear or tools. There was an efficiency to their movements, a sense of purpose that spoke of deep-rooted traditions and clear expectations. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked, finally, setting aside her empty bowl. "Now you work," Makawi replied matter-of-factly. "All who eat must work." The statement was delivered without judgment, a simple expression of how their society functioned. Rebecca nodded, relieved at the opportunity to contribute rather than remain a passive recipient of charity. "What can I do?" Makawi studied her for a moment, clearly assessing her capabilities. "You know plants, herbs, medicines?" Rebecca shook her head regretfully. "Not much. My mother knew some, but she died when I was young." "You sew?" "Yes," Rebecca answered with more confidence. "I can mend, make simple garments." Makawi seemed to find this acceptable. "Good. Today you help with hides. Tomorrow, maybe other tasks." She led Rebecca to where several women were working with animal skins in various stages of preparation. The process was both familiar and foreign. Rebecca had prepared hides before, but the Navajo methods differed from what she'd learned. Some skins were stretched on frames, others lay flat on the ground, being scraped with specialized tools. An older woman, her face deeply lined but her hands strong and sure, looked up as they approached. She and Makawi exchanged words in Navajo, the older woman's gaze flickering to Rebecca with undisguised skepticism. "This is Elder Sitala," Makawi explained. "She teaches you." Elder Sitala did not smile or offer any welcome, but she pointed to a space beside her and handed Rebecca a scraping tool when she sat. The hide before them was large, deer or perhaps elk, and partially cleaned. With no shared language, instruction came through demonstration. Elder Sitala showed Rebecca how to hold the tool, the angle at which to work, the direction of movement that would remove flesh without damaging the hide. Then she watched as Rebecca attempted to copy her technique, making small adjustments to her grip or posture with firm but not unkind hands. The work was physically demanding, requiring strength Rebecca wasn't sure she possessed in her weakened state. After an hour, her arms trembled with effort, sweat beaded on her forehead despite the morning coolness, and blisters were forming on her palms. She paused, flexing her fingers to ease the cramping. Elder Sitala watched her, dark eyes inscrutable. Rebecca expected criticism or impatience, but instead, the older woman simply handed her a small container of salve, gesturing for her to apply it to her hands. The ointment stung briefly, then brought blessed relief to her raw skin. Rebecca nodded her thanks before returning to the task, determined to contribute what she could despite her limitations. By midday, Rebecca was exhausted, her body reminding her forcefully that she was still recovering from severe dehydration and exposure. Elder Sitala seemed to recognize this without being told. She spoke briefly to Makawi, who had returned to check on their progress. "You rest now," Makawi said to Rebecca. "Later, more work." Rebecca wanted to protest, to prove herself capable of keeping pace with the Navajo women, but her body betrayed her. Her hands shook as she set down the scraping tool, her vision swimming slightly as she stood. Elder Sitala said something that made Makawi's lips quirk in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "What did she say?" Rebecca asked as they walked slowly back toward Nakohe's dwelling. "She says, white woman's hands soft like baby rabbit, but spirit not soft. Good combination." Coming from the stern-faced elder, this was high praise indeed. Rebecca felt a flush of pride that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the morning. "Will she let me continue helping tomorrow?" Makawi nodded. "If you wish. Many tasks need doing." The simple acceptance implicit in this statement touched Rebecca deeply. She was being offered not just temporary shelter, but a place in the daily life of the community. Provisional, perhaps, but real nonetheless. As they reached the dwelling, Makawi paused, her expression serious. "Council meets tonight. Elders decide if you stay longer." The statement sent a chill through Rebecca despite the warmth of the day. "What should I do?" Makawi considered the question. "Speak truth when asked. Show respect." She hesitated, then added more softly, "Nakohe speaks for you. This helps." With that, she ushered Rebecca inside to rest, leaving her with water, dried meat, and much to contemplate about the evening to come. Dusk settled over Tsei like a blanket, bringing with it a hush that seemed to Rebecca more expectant than peaceful. From her place inside Nakohe's dwelling, she could hear the sounds of the settlement preparing for evening, children being called home, cooking fires crackling, the low murmur of conversations in a language that remained largely incomprehensible to her. She had rested as instructed, allowing her battered body further recovery time, but sleep had eluded her. Tonight, the council would decide her fate. Despite Makawi's assurance that Nakohe would speak on her behalf, anxiety gnawed at her. What if they determined she was a threat to their community? What if they sent her away? The vastness of the territory surrounding them offered little hope for a lone woman with no supplies. As shadows lengthened across the packed earth floor, Rebecca smoothed her hands over the deerskin dress Makawi had provided. It still felt foreign against her skin, but she had to admit the practical garment was far better suited to life here than her tattered cotton dress had been. She re-braided her hair, wishing for a mirror but making do with touch alone, wanting to present herself as neatly as possible for the council. Just as the last light faded from the smoke hole above, the entrance flap was pushed aside. Nakohe entered, his expression as inscrutable as ever. He carried something in his hands, Rebecca's old boots, now repaired with sinew stitching and pieces of hide. "For walking," he said, setting them beside her. "Better than moccasins on rocky ground." The practical kindness of the gesture touched her. "Thank you. Did you fix them yourself?" Nakohe nodded once. "No leather work. Father taught." Rebecca ran her fingers over the careful stitches, stronger now than when the boots were new. Another debt she could never repay. "Council waits," Nakohe said, gesturing toward the entrance. "You come now." Rebecca pulled on the boots with hands that trembled slightly before rising to follow him. As they stepped outside, the full moon bathed the settlement in silver light, turning the curved roofs of dwellings into ghostly domes. In the center of the circle, a fire burned, surrounded by figures seated on woven mats or directly on the ground. Every eye turned toward them as they approached. Rebecca forced herself to walk tall, despite the weakness still lingering in her limbs, keeping her gaze steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. She counted 12 people in the circle, men and women of varying ages, all watching her with expressions ranging from open curiosity to guarded suspicion. Nakohe led her to the edge of the circle, indicating that she should sit on a low stool that had been placed there. He remained standing beside her, a presence both reassuring and imposing. An elderly man sitting directly across from Rebecca lifted a gnarled hand, and the soft conversations around the fire ceased. When he spoke, his voice carried surprising strength despite his advanced years. Makawi, seated to the elder's right, translated in a low voice. Head elder asks why you come to Diné lands. Rebecca clasped her hands in her lap to still their trembling. I didn't intend to, she answered, speaking clearly so all could hear. I was betrayed by a man who posed as a guide. He abandoned me in the canyon to die after taking everything I owned, Makawi translated. Several of the council members exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable in the flickering firelight. The head elder spoke again, longer this time, his weathered face impassive. He asks what you seek now, Makawi interpreted. What white woman wants from Diné? Rebecca considered her answer carefully. Platitudes or false humility would not serve her here. These people valued directness, she had learned, and survival necessitated honesty. I seek nothing except the chance to live, she said finally. I have no home to return to, no means to travel. I know I am a stranger here, but I am willing to work, to learn your ways, to contribute in whatever manner you deem appropriate for as long as you allow me to stay. As Makawi translated, Rebecca studied the faces around the fire. An older woman with silver-streaked hair frowned deeply. A middle-aged man with a scar running across his cheek leaned forward, saying something in a sharp tone that needed no translation to convey disagreement. The debate that followed excluded Rebecca entirely, conducted in rapid Navajo with occasional gestures in her direction. She remained still, back straight, eyes forward, trying to glean meaning from tone and expression where words failed her. After several minutes, Nakohe spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable authority. The council fell silent, listening as he addressed them at length. Rebecca wished desperately to understand his words, but his face told her nothing of their content. When he finished, the head elder turned his gaze once more to Rebecca. Through Makawi, he asked, what skills do you bring? What can you offer our people? I can sew, Rebecca answered promptly. I can cook, though not your food yet. I can learn to prepare hides as Elder Sitala showed me today. I am strong when not weakened by the sun, and I learn quickly. She hesitated, then added with simple honesty, I don't know your ways or your language, but I can learn those too if given the chance. The scarred man spoke again, his tone challenging. Makawi's translation came reluctantly. He asks how we know you won't bring others, soldiers, settlers, once you are well. The question struck at the heart of their legitimate fears. Rebecca met the man's gaze directly. I have no one to bring, she said quietly. My husband is dead. I have no family, no friends in this territory. The settlers who knew me believe I continued to California or died along the way. No one is looking for me. Nakohe added something that caused several council members to nod thoughtfully. What did you say? Rebecca whispered to him. I said tracks covered by wind. No one finds canyon path without guide who knows way. The scarred man seemed unconvinced, arguing further. Others joined in, voices rising and falling in deliberation. Rebecca remained silent, knowing that nothing more she could say would sway them. Her fate rested in their hands. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, The head elder raised his hand again, silencing the discussion. He spoke at length, his gaze moving from face to face around the circle, ending with Rebecca. When he finished, Makawi turned to her. "Elder, as you may stay until next full moon. You will work, learn our ways. Before next full moon, council meets again, decides if you stay longer." Relief flooded through Rebecca, so intense she felt momentarily lightheaded. A month. She had a month to prove herself useful, to demonstrate she posed no threat. "Thank you," she said, directing the words to the head elder but including the entire council in her gaze. "I am grateful for your mercy." The elderly man nodded once, acknowledging her words. Then he spoke again, his tone more severe. "He says you are Nakohe's responsibility," Makawi translated. "If you bring trouble, both suffer consequences." Rebecca glanced at Nakohe, suddenly understanding the risk he had taken in speaking for her. He had tied his own fate to hers, in the eyes of his people. "I understand," she said solemnly. "I won't bring trouble to any of you, or to Nakohe." The head elder studied her for a long moment, as if searching for deception, then nodded once. More. He spoke a final sentence, and the council members began to rise. The meeting evidently concluded. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked Nakohe as they walked back toward his dwelling, the moonlight casting long shadows before them. "Now you learn," he replied simply. "Tomorrow you begin." True to his word, Rebecca's education commenced at dawn. Makawi arrived as the first light touched the canyon rim, carrying a bundle of clothing and a determined expression. "These better for working," she said, offering Rebecca a loose cotton shirt and a long skirt woven in patterns of rust and cream. "Keep deerskin for cold days, ceremonies." Rebecca thanked her, changing quickly while Makawi waited outside. The new garments were clearly hand-woven, durable and practical, nothing like the manufactured fabrics she'd worn in her previous life. When she emerged, Makawi looked her over with a critical eye before nodding approval. "Today, you learn water, most important knowledge in desert." She led Rebecca beyond the settlement to where the small stream they'd visited yesterday emerged from a narrow crevice in the canyon wall. Several girls were already there, ranging in age from perhaps 8 to 14, carrying various containers. "These daughters of clan," Makawi explained. "They show you water paths." The girls regarded Rebecca with undisguised curiosity. Anna, slightly older than the rest, stepped forward and introduced herself as Kimi. Her English was limited but functional, clearly learned from interaction with traders. Under Kimi's guidance, and with Makawi's occasional interpretation, Rebecca learned the complex system of water management that sustained Tseyi. The spring that fed the visible stream was just one of several water sources. Others were hidden within the canyon network, accessible only through narrow passages or caves. Some produced water year-round, others only seasonally or after rains. The Navajo had developed intricate methods for collecting, storing, and conserving this precious resource. Clay vessels were positioned to catch drips from seeps in the rock. Channels had been carefully constructed to direct runoff into collection basins. Plants that indicated the presence of underground water were tended and protected. "Water gives life," Kimi explained seriously as they filled containers at a small spring hidden behind a stand of juniper trees. "We give thanks for water." She demonstrated a brief ritual of gratitude before dipping her vessel into the clear pool, sprinkling a few drops back as an offering before collecting what was needed. Rebecca followed her example, feeling awkward but understanding the profound significance of acknowledging dependence on this fundamental element. The morning passed in a blur of new information. Rebecca struggled to memorize locations, paths, signs that indicated water quality or quantity. Her still recovering body protested, the constant walking, climbing, and carrying, but she pushed through the discomfort, determined to learn. By midday, they returned to the settlement with their filled containers. Rebecca's arms trembled with effort, but she felt a sense of accomplishment at having contributed to this essential task. "You learn quick," Kimi said as they set down their burdens near the central cooking area. "Tomorrow, plant medicine." After a simple meal of corn cakes and dried fruit, Makawi led Rebecca to join the women working with hides once more. Elder Sitala greeted her with a slight nod that seemed almost approving, handing her the same scraping tool from yesterday. The work was no less demanding, but Rebecca found her hands remembered the proper technique. Elder Sitala occasionally corrected her positioning or demonstrated a more efficient movement, but mostly allowed her to work at her own pace. As the afternoon wore on, the women began to talk among themselves. Though Rebecca couldn't understand their words, the rhythm of their conversation, jokes that triggered laughter, questions followed by detailed explanations, the occasional spirited disagreement, was familiar and oddly comforting. Eventually, one of the younger women turned to Rebecca, saying something in Navajo that caused the others to look at her expectantly. Rebecca glanced at Elder Sitala in confusion. The older woman pantomimed drinking from a cup, then pointed to the young woman who had spoken. "Oh," Rebecca said, understanding dawning. "She's offering me water." She nodded gratefully to the young woman. "Thank you. Ahehe," she added, using the Navajo word for thanks that she'd heard Kimi use earlier. The simple attempt at their language produced smiles and a flurry of conversation. The young woman handed her a clay cup of cool water, then introduced herself as Yiska. "I learn English," Yiska said carefully, the words clearly practiced. "You teach?" Rebecca nodded eagerly. "Yes, I would be happy to teach you." Yiska smiled broadly. "I teach Dine Bizard Navajo words. Good trade?" "Very good trade," Rebecca agreed, feeling a tentative bridge forming across the cultural divide. The remainder of the afternoon passed more quickly, with Yiska teaching Rebecca basic Navajo words for the tools and materials they worked with, while Rebecca helped her practice English equivalents. The other women occasionally joined in, offering corrections or alternatives, laughing good-naturedly at Rebecca's attempts to produce the unfamiliar sounds of their language. By the time the work session ended, Rebecca felt a shift in the atmosphere. Not acceptance exactly, but perhaps a willingness to consider that she might become more than just a tolerated outsider. As she walked back to Nakohe's dwelling, her body aching but her spirit lighter, Rebecca spotted him returning from what appeared to be a hunting expedition. He carried several rabbits, their still forms hanging from a thong at his belt. Beside him walked another man, younger, with a bow slung across his back. Nakohe raised a hand in greeting as he saw her, saying something to his companion that made the younger man look at her with heightened interest. "Good hunting?" Rebecca asked as they drew closer. "Enough," Nakohe replied with characteristic brevity. He gestured to his companion. "This Talon, my sister's son." The young man, barely more than a boy, Rebecca realized, nodded to her, his expression a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "You are Becky," he said, clearly having practiced the English name. "Yes," she confirmed, smiling. "Rebecca Mitchell, but Becky is fine." Talon considered this, as if storing the information for future reference. "You stay with Dine?" "For now," Rebecca answered carefully. "The council has allowed me to remain until the next full moon." Talon nodded, glancing at his uncle. "I watch you shoot bow tomorrow?" Rebecca blinked in surprise. "I don't know how to use a bow." A look passed between Talon and Nakohe that she couldn't interpret. Then Nakohe said simply, "Tomorrow, you learn." Later, as dusk settled over the canyon, Rebecca sat outside the dwelling, watching as the community gathered for the evening meal. Unlike the settlers' tradition of individual family units dining separately, the Navajo shared food communally, at least for the evening meal. Large pots bubbled over central fires, tended by women who took turns with the cooking duties. Nakohe emerged from the dwelling, having stored his hunting spoils and cleaned himself at the stream. He carried 2 wooden bowls, handing one to Rebecca before settling beside her on the ground. "Why did Talon assume I would learn to use a bow?" she asked as they waited for the meal to be ready. Nakohe was silent for a moment, considering his answer. "All Diné learn to hunt, to defend. Women also." Rebecca absorbed this. Among her own people, women were taught household skills, not weapons. The idea that she might learn to hunt, to provide food through her own skill, rather than depending on men, was both frightening and exhilarating. "Do you think I can learn?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Nakohe glanced at her, something like amusement flickering in his dark eyes. "You survived Canyon. You have strength here." He tapped his chest. "And here," he touched his temple, "rest is just practice." Before she could respond, a call went up announcing that food was ready. They joined the line of people moving toward the cooking fires, each waiting their turn, as servers filled their bowls with a rich stew of rabbit, wild onions, and unfamiliar roots that smelled tantalizingly savory. Rebecca followed Nakohe to where Makawi sat with Talon, and an older woman Rebecca hadn't met. Makawi made room for them, introducing the older woman as Talon's grandmother, Istas. The family group ate together, conversation flowing around. Rebecca, in a mixture of Navajo and occasional English phrases, clearly included for her benefit. Though she understood only fragments, she felt the dynamic of the family unit. Istas's quiet authority, Makawi's practical intelligence, Talon's youthful energy, and Nakohe's steady presence. It struck her suddenly how long it had been since she'd eaten as part of a family. Even during the wagon train journey, as a widow, she had eaten alone more often than not. Thomas had been gone for months, but this was the first moment she truly felt the absence of family connections. "You are quiet," Makawi observed, studying Rebecca's face in the firelight. "Food not good?" "No, the food is wonderful," Rebecca assured her. "I was just thinking about—" She hesitated, unsure how to express the complex emotions swirling within her. "About belonging," she finished simply. Makawi seemed to understand more than Rebecca had put into words. She nodded slowly. "Hard to be away from clan, from home." "I don't have a clan anymore," Rebecca admitted softly. "My parents died years ago. I have no siblings, no children." Istas, who had been listening despite the language barrier, said something to Makawi, who translated. "Grandmother says everyone has ancestors, even if they walk in spirit world. You carry them with you." The concept touched something deep. In Rebecca, a recognition of truth she hadn't fully articulated even to herself. She did carry her parents with her. In her mother's skill with a needle that her fingers remembered, in her father's stubborn determination that rose in her when challenges seemed insurmountable. "Thank you," she said to Istas, meeting the older woman's wise eyes. "That helps me." After the meal, as families began to drift back to their dwellings, Talon approached Rebecca, a handcrafted flute in his hands. "You like music?" he asked, his expression earnest despite his halting English. "Very much," Rebecca replied with genuine enthusiasm. "Do you play?" In answer, Talon raised the flute to his lips and began a haunting melody that seemed to rise and fall like the wind through canyon walls. The sound carried in the evening air, drawing attention from those nearby. Some paused to listen, nodding appreciation. When the brief song ended, Rebecca applauded softly. "That was beautiful. What is it called?" Talon considered, searching for the right words. "Song of first light, when sun touches mountain." "Dawn," Rebecca supplied. "The Song of Dawn." He nodded, pleased with the translation. "Yes, dawn song. He held out the flute, offering it to her. "You try?" Rebecca hesitated, then accepted the instrument, examining its smooth surface, the carefully positioned finger holes. "I don't know how." Talon demonstrated the proper hand position, then showed her how to create the initial sound by blowing across rather than into the mouthpiece. Rebecca's first attempt produced nothing but a whisper of air, but Talon encouraged her to try again. On her third attempt, a clear note emerged, wavering but recognizable. The achievement brought a smile to her face that matched Talon's delighted grin. "Good!" he exclaimed. "You practice, soon play Dawn's song." As he showed her the fingering for different notes, Rebecca became aware of Nakohe watching them from his place by the fire, his expression thoughtful. When their eyes met, he nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. Later, as she prepared for sleep in her corner of Nakohe's dwelling, Rebecca found herself contemplating the day's experiences. In just hours, she had gone from outsider barely tolerated to someone who carried water, worked hides, began learning the language, and was invited to share music. Small steps, perhaps insignificant in the grand scheme of her situation, but meaningful. Nonetheless, she had a month to prove herself worthy of remaining. A month to learn as much as possible, to make herself useful enough that sending her away would be a loss rather than a relief. As she drifted toward sleep, Rebecca found herself wondering what Thomas would think of her current circumstances. Her conventional husband had valued propriety above most things. Would he be horrified to find his widow living among people he would have considered savages? Or would he, like her, have discovered that the labels and prejudices carried from the East held little relevance in this harsh but beautiful territory, where survival depended on community and adaptation? The question had no answer. Thomas was gone, his rigid perspectives buried with him. Rebecca remained, and each day she was becoming someone new, someone stronger, more capable, less constrained by expectations she had never questioned before. Morning arrived with soft footsteps. Outside the dwelling and a gentle call. "Becky, you awake?" It was Talon, his voice pitched low to avoid disturbing others who might still be sleeping. Rebecca rose quickly, smoothing her hair and adjusting her borrowed clothing before stepping outside into the grey light of early. "Your dawn." Talon waited, a bow in one hand and a quiver of arrows in the other. He grinned when he saw her, excitement evident in his youthful face. "Uncle says teach you bow today," he explained. "Better start early when hands not tired from other work." Rebecca glanced around, noting that most of the settlement was still quiet, though a few early risers moved about their morning tasks. "Now?" Talon nodded eagerly. "Best time. Quiet, cool, animals come to water." The prospect of handling a weapon so early in her training was intimidating, but Rebecca recognized the opportunity being offered. If she could learn to hunt, to contribute meat to the community's stores, her value would increase significantly. "Let me get my boots," she said, ducking back inside to retrieve the footwear Nakohe had repaired. When she emerged, Talon led her toward the edge of the settlement, following a narrow path that wound among juniper trees and rock formations. They reached a small clearing where several crude targets had been set up. Bundles of grass and twigs bound together in roughly animal shapes positioned at varying distances. Talon set down the quiver and held out the bow for her inspection. "My first bow," he explained, a note of pride in his voice. "Made when I was." He held his hand at chest height, indicating a child's stature. "Good for learning, not too strong." Rebecca accepted the weapon carefully, surprised by its weight and the smooth polish of the wood. She ran her fingers along its length, admiring the craftsmanship. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "Are you sure you want to lend it to me?" Talon nodded. "Uncle says you need learn. I help." He positioned himself beside her. "First, how to hold." What followed was a meticulous lesson in basic archery. Talon was a patient teacher despite his youth, demonstrating proper stance, grip, and drawing technique. He corrected her positioning with gentle adjustments, explaining each element in his limited but growing English. Rebecca's first attempts to draw the bow revealed muscles she hadn't known existed. The strain across her shoulders and back was immediate and intense, a burning that spoke of weakness she would need to overcome. Hard at first, Talon acknowledged, noting her struggle. Gets easier. Body remembers. When she finally loosed her first arrow, it fell pathetically short of even the nearest target, disappearing into the brush several yards away. Talon retrieved it without comment, handing it back for her to try again. By her 10th attempt, Rebecca managed to hit the ground directly in front of the closest target. By the 20th, she grazed its side. Each small improvement brought a nod of approval from her young instructor. As the sun climbed higher, heating the small clearing, Rebecca's arms trembled with exertion and her fingers were rubbed raw from the bowstring. Just as she was about to suggest they stop, a shadow fell across the clearing. Nakohe stood watching, them, his expression unreadable. Beside him was Elder Sitala, who studied Rebecca with keen interest. "Show," Nakohe said simply, gesturing toward the targets. Rebecca swallowed hard, acutely aware of the scrutiny. She nocked an arrow as Talon had taught her, focusing on maintaining proper form despite her exhaustion. Drawing the bow sent fresh pain through her strained muscles, but she held steady, aimed, and released. The arrow struck the middle target, not center but solidly within its bound form. A respectable shot for a first day's training. Elder Sitala made a sound that might have been approval. She spoke briefly to Nakohe before turning and walking. Back toward the settlement, her message delivered in words Rebecca couldn't understand, but in a tone that suggested satisfaction. What did she say? Rebecca asked Nakohe once the elder was out of earshot. She says women who hunt feed themselves, he replied. Important skill for one who lives alone. The implication was clear. Elder Sitala assumed Rebecca would eventually leave the Navajo, returning to a solitary existence. The thought sent a chill through her despite the warming day. "I'm grateful for the teaching," she said carefully, "whether I stay or go." Nakohe studied her for a long moment. "Learning, never wasted," he said finally. Then with a nod to Talon, he added, "Enough for today. Hands need healing before more practice." Looking down, Rebecca saw that her fingers were indeed bleeding where the bowstring had worn away the skin. Talon produced a small container of salve similar to what Elder Sitala had given her for her blistered palms, demonstrating how to apply it to the specific injuries of archery. "Tomorrow, finger guards," he promised, as they gathered the equipment, "make from leather." As they walked back to the settlement, Rebecca found herself wondering at the contradictions of her situation. On one hand, she was being taught valuable skills that would serve her whether she remained with the Navajo or was eventually sent away. On the other, there was an underlying assumption that her presence was temporary, that she would ultimately return to the white world despite having no place within it. The thought was more painful than it should have been after less than a week among these people who were still largely strangers. Yet something about their way of life, the practical skills, the community interdependence, the direct connection to the natural world, called to something deep within her, something that had never found expression in her previous existence. Rebecca glanced at Nakohe, walking silently beside her, and wondered if he sensed her internal conflict. Did he also assume she would eventually leave? Or did he see potential for her to truly become part of this community? The question remained unasked as they reached the settlement, where the day's work awaited and there was no time for philosophical uncertainty. Learning to belong, truly belong, would require more than mastering a bow or memorizing vocabulary. It would mean understanding a way of seeing the world fundamentally different from everything she had been taught. The challenge was immense, the time limited, the outcome uncertain. But as Rebecca joined the women gathering for the day's weaving lesson, she felt a spark of determination that had nothing to do with mere survival and everything to do with embracing a life she had never imagined possible. The waning moon hung low in the pre-dawn sky, a reminder that time was slipping away. 2 weeks had passed since the council granted Rebecca temporary sanctuary, which meant 2 weeks remained before they would decide her ultimate fate. Each morning, when she emerged from Navajo's dwelling, she found herself glancing instinctively at the moon, measuring its phase against her uncertain future. Today, she rose before most of the settlement, her body now accustomed to the early hours kept by the Navajo. Her hands, once soft and prone to blistering, had developed protective calluses from daily work. The persistent ache in her shoulders from archery practice had settled into a dull background sensation rather than sharp discomfort. Small adaptations that spoke of growing resilience. Rebecca made her way to the stream alone, no longer needing guidance to navigate the settlement or its immediate surroundings. The water felt bracingly cold as she washed her face and hands, a pleasant shock against skin that had grown accustomed to the dry heat of canyon days. "You are early," a voice observed from behind her. Rebecca turned to find Makawi approaching, a clay water vessel balanced on her hip. In the soft dawn light, Nakohe's sister looked less severe than usual, her features relaxed in the quiet of morning. "I couldn't sleep," Rebecca admitted. "Too many thoughts." Makawi nodded, as if this was entirely expected. "Moon changes, time passes, you worry about council." It wasn't a question, but Rebecca answered anyway. "Yes, I've tried to learn quickly, to be useful, but I don't know if it's enough." Makawi set down her vessel, kneeling beside the stream to fill it. "Council watches," she said simply. "They see how you work, how you learn language, how you respect ways." "And what do they think?" Rebecca pressed, desperate for some insight into her prospects. Makawi was silent for a moment, carefully filing her container before meeting Rebecca's anxious gaze. "Some say you try too hard to please," she said with surprising directness. "Wonder if heart is honest or just afraid." The assessment struck uncomfortably close to truth. Rebecca had indeed been driven partly by fear, working to exhaustion each day to prove her value. But beneath that fear lay something else, genuine respect for the community that had taken her in, sincere desire to understand their ways. "Both," she admitted finally. "I'm afraid of being sent away, but I also truly want to learn, to understand. Your people have knowledge my people have forgotten, how to live with the land, not just on it." Makawi studied her face, searching for deception. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "Good answer. Truth has layers like canyon rock." She lifted her filled vessel with practiced ease. "Today you go with hunting party. Nakohe says you ready to observe." The pronouncement caught Rebecca by surprise. Hunting parties were primarily composed of men, though she had learned that Navajo women occasionally participated, particularly in communal hunts. That Nakohe deemed her ready to observe was unexpected validation of her progress with the bow. "When do they leave?" she asked, rising quickly. "After morning meal, wear sturdy boots, bring water. Day will be long." Rebecca hurried back to prepare, excitement mingling with trepidation. Hunting represented a level of integration into community life beyond the women's work she had primarily been assigned. It also offered the opportunity to observe Nakohe in his element, to learn from his expertise. After a quick meal of cornmeal mush sweetened with dried berries, Rebecca joined the assembling hunting party at the edge of the settlement. 6 men, including Nakohe and young Talon, stood checking their weapons and supplies. They fell silent as she approached, several eyeing her with undisguised skepticism. Nakohe acknowledged her with a slight nod. "You watch today. Learn how track, how approach, how honor animal that gives life." One of the older hunters said something in rapid Navajo, his tone clearly disapproving. Rebecca recognized enough words to understand. He questioned her presence, suggesting she would frighten away game with clumsy movements. Nakohe's response was calm but firm. The older man scowled, but offered no further objection. Talon caught Rebecca's eye and gave an encouraging smile. "Stay behind me," Nakohe instructed Rebecca as they set out. "Step where I step, no talking." She nodded understanding, taking her place behind him as the hunting party moved out in single file. Their path led away from the settlement, following a barely discernible trail that wound through stands of juniper and pinon pine before beginning to climb the canyon wall via a series of narrow switchbacks. The ascent was steep, challenging even for Rebecca's increasingly fit body. She focused on placing her feet exactly where Nakohe had stepped, watching his movements and trying to mimic his balanced, deliberate gait. Sweat soon soaked her shirt despite the early hour, but she refused to ask for rest, determined not to. Confirm the older hunter's low expectations. They reached the canyon rim as the sun cleared the eastern horizon, bathing the landscape in golden light. Rebecca suppressed a gasp at the vista spread before them, miles of rugged territory stretching to distant mesas. The canyon they had just climbed, cutting a sinuous path through red rock formations. From this height, the Navajo settlement was invisible, tucked into the protective embrace of stone walls. Nakohe paused, allowing her a moment to absorb the view before gesturing for her to continue following. The hunting party spread out slightly as they moved across the rim, each man scanning the ground and vegetation for signs of game. Talon dropped back to walk beside Rebecca, pointing out tracks and marking signs she would have missed without guidance. A tuft of fur caught on a thorny bush, droppings that indicated deer had passed recently. The particular way certain grasses were bent by passing animals. They walked for nearly 2 hours before Nakohe raised a hand, bringing the party to an immediate halt. He crouched, examining something on the ground that Rebecca couldn't see from her position. The hunters gathered around him, voices lowered as they discussed the finding. Talon motioned for Rebecca to join them. "Mule deer," he whispered, pointing to distinctive tracks in the dry soil. "Big male, pass here this morning." Nakohe stood, surveying the surrounding terrain before making a decision. He issued quiet instructions, and the hunting party divided into 3 smaller groups, positioned to intercept the deer's likely path or drive it toward waiting hunters. Rebecca remained with Nakohe and Talon, following their careful advance. Through increasingly dense vegetation, every step was placed with deliberate precision, every movement calculated to minimize sound. She found herself holding her breath, then consciously releasing it in the slow, measured way Talon had taught her during archery practice. They had moved perhaps half a mile when Nakohe suddenly froze, his raised hand signaling absolute stillness. Through a screen of juniper branches, Rebecca caught sight of their quarry, a magnificent mule deer with impressive antlers, grazing in a small clearing 30 yards ahead. The animal was larger than she had expected, muscular and alert, its ears constantly swiveling to catch any sound of danger. Rebecca remained motionless, scarcely daring to breathe as Nakohe slowly, imperceptibly raised his bow. The shot, when it came, was so swift and fluid it seemed part of the natural movement of wind through branches. The arrow struck true, catching the deer just behind the shoulder. The animal leaped, bolting through the clearing, but Rebecca could see the arrow had found its mark. "Now we follow," Talon whispered, as Nakohe moved forward, eyes fixed on the ground, where drops of blood marked the deer's passage. "Not long. Arrow good." They tracked the wounded deer for nearly half a mile before finding it collapsed in a small gully, still breathing but unable to rise. Nakohe approached with reverence, kneeling beside the magnificent creature. He spoke softly in Navajo, words Rebecca couldn't understand but recognized as a prayer of thanks. Then, with swift mercy, he ended the deer's suffering with a single knife stroke to the throat. The hunters who had separated earlier rejoined them, alerted by a distinctive bird call Talon had made. What followed was a systematic process that fascinated Rebecca despite its bloody reality. The deer was field-dressed with practiced efficiency, its internal organs removed, some buried with apparent ceremony, others carefully preserved for later use. Nothing was wasted, nothing treated casually. When the initial processing was complete, the hunters constructed a carrying frame from branches and sinew. The deer, considerably lighter without its internal organs, but still a substantial weight, was secured to this improvised travois for the journey back. "You help carry," Nakohe said to Rebecca, not a question, but an invitation to participate. She nodded, taking her place beside Talon at one end of the carrying frame, while two other hunters positioned themselves at the opposite end. The return journey was arduous, the added weight of their prize making every step a test of endurance. They took turns, rotating positions to share the burden equally. Rebecca's muscles burned with effort, but she welcomed the pain as proof of contribution. She was not merely observing now, but actively participating in bringing sustenance to the community. By mid-afternoon, they descended the canyon trail, moving carefully on the steep path with their precious cargo. As they approached the settlement, children spotted them and ran ahead, announcing their successful hunt. By the time they reached the central area, most of the community had gathered to welcome the returning hunters. Elder Sitala stepped forward, examining the deer with approving eyes before speaking words that Talon translated for Rebecca's benefit. She says, "Deer gives great gift, many will eat, nothing wasted." The deer was carefully hung from a sturdy frame where the remaining processing would take place. Rebecca watched as the hide was skillfully removed in one piece, immediately taken. By waiting women to begin the preservation process, the meat was butchered with precision, different cuts allocated according to traditions Rebecca was still learning. She stood slightly apart, observing the community work together in this essential task when Makawi appeared at her side. "You helped bring meat," she stated, her tone carrying a note of approval Rebecca hadn't heard before. "Good work." "I only carried," Rebecca demurred. "Nakohe made the kill." Makawi shook her head. "All have purpose in hunt. Carrying honors, deer that gives life." She handed Rebecca a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "For hands will be sore tomorrow." The bundle contained the same healing salve Rebecca had been given for blisters, a gesture of care that touched her deeply. "Thank you." Before Makawi could respond, the head elder approached, his weathered face solemn as he studied Rebecca. He spoke briefly to Makawi, who translated, "Elder asks if you understand what you saw today." Rebecca considered her answer carefully, aware that this was not a casual inquiry, but an assessment of her comprehension. "I saw how hunting is not just killing an animal for food," she said slowly. "It is relationship, respect for the deer's life, gratitude for its sacrifice, responsibility to use every part wisely." Makawi translated. The head elder listened impassively, then asked another question. He asks how this differs from white hunters. Rebecca winced internally, thinking of the wasteful practices she had witnessed. Trophy hunters, who took only antlers or hides, leaving meat to rot. Settlers who killed more than needed for sport or out of fear of predators. "Too often, my people hunt without respect or gratitude," she admitted. "They take more than needed, waste what they don't immediately want, see animals as objects rather. than beings with their own purpose. When this was translated, the head elder studied her face for a long moment before nodding once and walking away without further comment. Rebecca looked questioningly at Makawi. Was that the right answer? Was it truth? Makawi countered. Yes. Then it was right answer. The remainder of the day passed in feast preparation. The successful hunt called for celebration, a sharing of the bounty with the entire community. Rebecca was assigned to help Yiska prepare special bread cakes that would accompany the fresh meat. As they worked, kneading cornmeal dough and shaping it into flat rounds for cooking on hot stones, Yiska continued their ongoing language exchange. "How say this?" she asked, holding up the grinding stone used to process corn. "Grinding stone, or mortar," Rebecca replied, then attempted the Navajo word Yiska had taught her previously. "Jedediah?" Yiska beamed at her pronunciation. "Good! You learn fast." "Not fast enough," Rebecca sighed, glancing at the waning moon visible through the dwelling's smoke hole. "Council decides soon." Yiska's expression grew serious. "You want stay?" The question gave Rebecca pause. Did she want to stay? When first rescued, her only thought had been survival. Then, practical considerations had dominated. Where would she go? How would she live if sent away? But now, after weeks of immersion in Navajo life, her feelings had evolved into something more complex. "Yes," she admitted, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I want to stay. I have much more to learn, and—" She hesitated, struggling to articulate the deeper truth. "I feel more myself here than I ever did in the white world." Yiska nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. "Sometimes person born to one people, spirit belongs to another." She pressed a warm hand over Rebecca's. "Many hope you stay." The simple statement of acceptance brought unexpected tears to Rebecca's eyes. She blinked them away, focusing on the task before her, but the warmth of Yiska's words remained, a comfort against uncertain days ahead. The evening feast took place under the open sky, with the entire community gathered around multiple fires. The atmosphere was festive, yet reverent, a celebration of continued life through the deer's sacrifice. Elder Sitala led prayers before. Eating, her sonorous voice rising and falling in cadences Rebecca was beginning to recognize, if not fully understand. She sat with Nakohe's family group, now a familiar arrangement that felt increasingly natural. Istas, Talon's grandmother, passed her a choice portion of meat with a nod that conveyed both approval and instruction. This was how it was done. How traditions were maintained through shared meals and distribution according to specific protocols. As Rebecca savored the tender meat, prepared with herbs she was learning to recognize, Nakohe spoke, his voice low enough that only those in their immediate circle could hear. "You did well today," followed instructions, moved quietly, showed respect. Coming from the typically taciturn hunter, this was high praise indeed. Rebecca felt a flush of pride warm her cheeks. "Thank you for allowing me to join the hunt," she said sincerely. "It taught me much I couldn't learn any other way." Nakohe nodded, taking a drink from his cup before responding. "Tomorrow you track, important skill for desert survival." The prospect of more direct instruction from Nakohe, who rarely engaged in lengthy conversation, yet whose actions consistently showed consideration for her welfare, filled Rebecca with quiet anticipation. Each new skill decreased her dependence, increased her value to the community, and deepened her understanding of this way of life, so different from what she had known. After the meal, as families lingered around the fires, sharing stories and songs, Talon appeared with his flute and a small bundle wrapped in soft hide. "For you," he said, offering the bundle to Rebecca, "made by my hands." Surprised, she unwrapped the gift to find a flute similar to his own, but smaller, perfectly sized for her hands. The smooth wood had been lovingly polished, decorated with simple carved designs. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the intricate work. "You made this for me?" Talon nodded, a shy smile lighting his young face. "You practice many days, ready for own flute now." Rebecca had indeed been practicing with Talon's instrument whenever time allowed, finding unexpected solace in the simple, haunting melodies he taught her. That he had crafted a flute specifically for her, an instrument that would normally be passed down within families, spoke volumes about her gradual acceptance within the community. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, deeply moved by the gesture. "Say nothing. Play," Talon suggested, lifting his own flute to demonstrate. Rebecca positioned her new instrument as he had taught her, finding it fit her hands perfectly. She played a simple melody, the notes wavering slightly but recognizable. As the dawn song Talon had first performed for her, others around the fire paused in their conversations, listening as the student and teacher played a duet that rose into the night air, mingling with smoke from the fires and starlight from the vast sky above. When they finished, there was a moment of appreciative silence before conversations resumed. Istas leaned toward Rebecca, saying something in Navajo that made Makawi smile. "What did she say?" Rebecca asked. "She says music speaks when words cannot," Makawi translated. "Shows true heart." Later, as the gathering dispersed for the night, Rebecca walked slowly back to Nakohe's dwelling, cradling her new flute like the precious gift it was. The waning moon cast long shadows across the settlement, a silent reminder of time passing, decisions approaching. Nakohe fell into step beside her, his presence solid and reassuring in the darkness. "Your nephew has great skill," Rebecca said, raising the flute slightly. "This is a beautiful gift." "He sees you now as family," Nakohe replied simply. "Music bond, stronger than blood sometimes." The statement hung in the night air between them, laden with implications Rebecca wasn't sure she fully grasped. Was Talon's gift merely personal, or did it represent something broader, a young person's advocacy for her inclusion in the community? "The council meeting approaches," she said after a moment, unable to keep the concern from her voice. "What will happen if they decide I cannot stay?" Nakohe was silent for several steps, considering his answer with typical care. "If council says go, I guide you to Trading Post near Ghost Pine Forest. Safer than Canyon has water source. People there sometimes need woman who knows both worlds." The practical answer both reassured and disappointed Rebecca. He had clearly thought ahead, planned for her potential departure. A kindness, certainly, but also an indication that he considered it a real possibility. "And if they allow me to stay," she asked, heart quickening at the alternative, "then you continue learning. Winter comes soon, many skills needed for cold season." They had reached the dwelling. Nakohe paused at the entrance, studying her face in the moonlight. "Council listens to those who speak," he said enigmatically. "Remember this." Before she could ask what he meant, he ducked inside, leaving Rebecca alone with the night breeze and her tumultuous thoughts. The following days passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Nakohe taught Rebecca tracking skills, how to read the subtle signs animals left behind, how to determine their size, species, direction of travel, and how recently they had passed. It was a complex language written in disturbed soil, broken twigs, and occasional fur or feathers that required intense concentration and practice to interpret. Rebecca absorbed everything he taught with fierce dedication, pushing herself beyond exhaustion each day. Her determination was fueled not only by the looming council decision, but by genuine fascination with these essential survival skills. "You push too hard," Nakohe observed one afternoon as they returned from a particularly long tracking exercise. Body needs rest to learn properly. There's no time for rest, Rebecca replied, frustration edging her voice. The full moon is in 3 days. I need to know as much as possible before then. Nakohe stopped walking, turning to face her directly. Council does not measure how much you know, he said with unusual intensity. They measure who you are becoming. The statement silenced her momentarily. What does that mean? Means knowledge without understanding is empty, he answered. Like tracking deer but never hunting. Pointless. Rebecca considered his words as they resumed walking. You think I'm learning without understanding? I think you fear too. Much, he corrected gently. Fear clouds vision, makes you see only what could be lost, not what has been found. The insight was uncomfortably accurate. Since awakening in Nako's dwelling weeks ago, Rebecca had been driven primarily by fear. Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of returning to the hostile wilderness alone. That fear had pushed her to work harder, learn faster, prove herself useful in every possible way. But Nakohe was suggesting a different approach, one that valued quality of integration over quantity of skills acquired, that emphasized becoming rather than performing. How do I show them who I am becoming, she asked finally, when I'm not sure myself? Nakohe's expression softened almost imperceptibly. You already show, every day, every choice. Council sees more than you think. That evening, as Rebecca sat outside the dwelling practicing her flute, Makawi joined her, settling companionably on the ground nearby. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes as the settlement prepared for nightfall around them. Full moon comes soon, Makawi observed eventually, echoing Rebecca's constant awareness. You ready for council? I don't know, Rebecca admitted, setting aside her flute. I've learned so much, but there's so much more I don't understand. Nakohe says the council measures who I am becoming, not what I know. My brother is wise, Makawi nodded. Too few words sometimes, but wise heart. Rebecca smiled at this accurate assessment of Nakohe's taciturn nature. What do you think the council will decide? Makawi considered the question, her dark eyes reflecting the dying sunlight. Some minds already made. Elder Sitala speaks. For you, says your hands work hard, your mind learns well. Others worry still about danger you might bring. I would never deliberately bring danger, Rebecca protested. Not deliberately, Makawi agreed. But white world follows white woman, even when she does not call it. The statement gave Rebecca pause. She hadn't considered that her mere presence might eventually draw unwanted attention to the Navajo settlement, regardless of her own intentions. The thought was sobering. If I thought staying would bring harm to your people, I would leave willingly, she said quietly. Makawi studied her face, searching for truth in the statement. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. Council meets after tomorrow's sunset, she said finally. You will speak. Prepare your heart's words, not just mouth words. Heart's words, not mouth words. The distinction resonated with what Nakohe had said about becoming rather than performing. Rebecca nodded slowly, understanding the guidance offered by both siblings. Thank you, she said simply, for everything you've taught me. Whatever the council decides, I am grateful. Makawi reached out, briefly touching Rebecca's hand in a rare gesture of physical connection. Sleep well. Tomorrow, busy day. As predicted, the day before the council meeting was filled with intense activity. The community was preparing for a ceremony that would coincide with the full moon, requiring special foods, cleansing rituals, and the preparation of ceremonial spaces. Rebecca was assigned to work with Elder Sitala and several other women, grinding specific herbs and roots for ritual use. The elder supervised closely, correcting Rebecca's technique when necessary, but offering approving nods when she worked correctly. During a brief rest, Rebecca gathered her courage to ask a question that had been troubling her. "Elder Sitala," she began, trying her best to pronounce the name with proper respect. "May I ask about the ceremony tomorrow?" The older woman regarded her thoughtfully before responding in halting but clear English. "Moon ceremony, balance returning, light and dark." Rebecca nodded, trying to understand. "Will the ceremony happen before or after the council meets about me?" Elder Sitala's weathered face revealed nothing of her thoughts. "After. Council decision becomes part of ceremony." The statement sent a chill through Rebecca. Whatever the council decided would be incorporated into a sacred ceremony, giving it weight and permanence beyond what she had anticipated. "I don't want to disrupt your important traditions," she said carefully. "If my presence is a problem..." Elder Sitala raised a hand, silencing her. "Not problem. Part of greater pattern." She pointed to the mortar where they had been grinding. Herbs, where different plants had been transformed into a unified mixture. Many elements become one medicine, nothing accidental. The philosophical approach was both comforting and mystifying. Rebecca wasn't entirely sure if Elder Sitala was advocating for her inclusion or simply stating that whatever happened was meant to be. Before she could seek clarification, they were called back to work, the conversation left unfinished. The remainder of the day passed in focused labor, leaving little time for conversation or reflection. By evening, Rebecca was physically exhausted, but mentally alert, her thoughts circling ceaselessly around the approaching council meeting. As she prepared for sleep, Nakohe entered the dwelling, carrying a small bundle. He set it beside her sleeping mat without explanation. "What is this?" Rebecca asked, curious. "For tomorrow," he replied. "Open in morning." She wanted to ask more, but his expression made it clear no further explanation would be forthcoming. With a slight nod, he moved to his own sleeping area, effectively ending the conversation. Rebecca lay awake long into the night, listening to the familiar sounds of the settlement settling into darkness, distant voices gradually quieting, the occasional cry of a nightbird, the whisper of wind through juniper branches. In these weeks, she had grown accustomed to these sounds, finding comfort in their rhythm and predictability. The thought of leaving, of being cast once more into uncertainty, created a hollow ache in her chest. Yet, beneath that fear lay something unexpected, confidence that she would survive whatever came. The skills she had learned here would not be taken from her, nor would the strength she had discovered within herself. Morning arrived, with golden light streaming through the smoke hole. Rebecca rose, immediately aware that Nakohe had already left for his dawn hunting. The small bundle he had left remained beside her sleeping mat, a mystery waiting to be solved. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a leather pouch containing several items. A small knife with a bone handle intricately carved, a braided leather bracelet embedded with turquoise beads, and a packet of seeds she recognized as those from medicinal plants Makawi had taught her to identify. The gifts, practical, beautiful, and symbolic of both present skills and future growth, brought tears to her eyes. Whether meant as parting tokens or welcome gifts, they represented acceptance of who she had become during her time with the Navajo. Rebecca secured the bracelet around her wrist, tucked the knife and seeds into her garment's pocket, and stepped outside to face whatever the day would bring, no longer consumed by fear, but ready to speak her heart's truth to those who would decide her fate. The full moon rose over Tseyi like a silent witness, casting the canyon in silver light that transformed the familiar landscape into something both ethereal and ancient. Rebecca stood at the entrance of Nakohe's dwelling, watching as the Navajo community gathered for both council meeting and ceremony, their movements deliberate and purposeful in the luminous night. She touched the braided bracelet at her wrist, drawing strength from its presence as she stepped forward to join them. Makawi appeared at her side, dressed in ceremonial garments adorned with intricate beadwork that caught the moonlight. "It is time," she said simply, guiding Rebecca toward the gathering. The council had assembled in the central space, seated in a half-circle that faced the largest fire. The head elder occupied the center position, flanked by other respected members, including Elder Satala. The rest of the community formed an outer circle, silent observers to the proceedings that would determine Rebecca's fate. Nakohe stood slightly apart, his tall figure unmistakable in the moonlight. When he saw Rebecca approach, he moved to stand beside her, a gesture of support that did not go unnoticed by the watching council. The head elder raised his hand, and complete silence fell over the gathering. He spoke in Navajo, his words measured and formal. Makawi translated in hushed tones for Rebecca's benefit. "Tonight we gather under Grandmother Moon to decide the path forward. The stranger among us has lived in our midst for one cycle. We must determine if she stays or returns to her own people." The elder gestured for Rebecca to step forward into the space between the council and the fire. As she did, the flames illuminated her features, casting her face in a dance of light and shadow. "Speak your heart," the elder instructed through Makawi's translation. "Why should you remain with Diné when your own kind wait beyond the canyon?" Rebecca had prepared words, carefully rehearsed phrases about gratitude and respect, but standing before the council, they evaporated like morning mist. Instead, she found herself speaking truths she had only just discovered within herself. "When I was found in the canyon," she began, her voice clear despite her racing heart, "I was barely alive in body and completely lost in spirit. My husband dead, my possessions stolen, my trust betrayed by someone of my own kind." She paused, gathering her thoughts as the flames crackled beside her. "The people I traveled with saw me as a burden to be abandoned when convenient. The guide I trusted saw me as something to be used and discarded. But Nakohe saw me differently, as someone worth saving, despite our differences." Rebecca glanced around the circle, meeting eyes that watched her with varying degrees of acceptance, suspicion, and curiosity. "In these weeks, I have learned that survival isn't just about having food and shelter. It's about belonging, contributing, being part of something larger than oneself. I've learned that knowledge passed through generations carries wisdom my people have forgotten in our rush to conquer rather than understand." She touched the knife at her belt, Nakohe's gift, drawing strength from its presence. "I don't ask to stay because I have nowhere else to go, though that is true. I ask to stay because here, for the first time, I am becoming the person I was meant to be, someone who listens to the land, who takes only what is needed, who understands that all life is connected." The council remained silent, their faces impassive as Makawi translated Rebecca's words. When she finished, the head elder spoke again, addressing not Rebecca, but Nakohe. "You brought this woman to our people. You speak for her. What do you say now that the moon is full?" Nakohe stepped forward, his profile strong against the firelight. Rebecca had never heard him speak at length before the council, and she held her breath, waiting. "I found her fighting for life when others had abandoned her," he said, his deep voice carrying easily to all gathered. "She did not surrender to death, though it would have been easier. Since coming among us, she has shown the same spirit, learning our ways not just with hands, but with heart, respecting traditions not out of fear, but understanding." He turned slightly, his gaze meeting Rebecca's for a moment before returning to the council. Some fear she brings danger. All strangers bring change. This is truth. But change comes whether we welcome it or not. Better to face it with allies who bridge worlds than to stand alone. The scarred hunter who had objected to Rebecca's presence on the hunting expedition spoke up, his voice sharp with challenge. And when soldiers come looking for missing white woman, when settlers accuse Diné of stealing their kind, what then? Nakohe answered without hesitation. No one searches for the dead. To her people, she is gone. To us, she can be valuable. One who knows both worlds, who can help us understand what comes. The debate that followed excluded Rebecca once more, conducted in rapid Navajo that Makawi could not fully translate. Different council members spoke in turn, some gesturing toward Rebecca, others referencing events or concepts she didn't understand. Through it all, she remained standing in the firelight, back straight, eyes forward, exhibiting the quiet dignity she had learned from watching the Navajo elders. Fear still fluttered in her chest, but it no longer controlled her. Whatever the council decided, she had spoken her truth. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, Elder Sitala rose from her place in the council. The other voices fell silent as she approached Rebecca, studying her face in the firelight with those penetrating dark eyes that missed nothing. She spoke directly to Rebecca, her halting English carrying unexpected authority. "You wear bracelet. Know what means?" Rebecca glanced down at the turquoise-studded band Nakohe had given her. "It was a gift," she said hesitantly. "I thought for courage." A murmur rippled through the watching crowd. Elder Sitala's expression remained serious. "Is family token, shows connection." She glanced at Nakohe, then back to Rebecca. Acceptance into clan. Realization dawned slowly. The bracelet wasn't merely a gift. It was a declaration of Nakohe's willingness to claim her as family, to formally integrate her into the clan structure that formed the foundation of Navajo society. Elder Sitala turned to address the council, speaking at length in Navajo. When she finished, she reached for Rebecca's hand, examining the calluses that had formed over weeks of work. "Hands show truth," she said simply. "These not white woman's hands anymore." The head elder spoke again, prompting Mikawi to translate once more. He asks if you are willing to accept clan responsibilities, to be not visitor but family, to learn sacred ways, to keep them private from outside eyes, to defend community as your own. The question was more profound than anything Rebecca had anticipated. Not mere permission to remain, but invitation to belong in the deepest sense, to become Diné in all but birth. "I am willing," she answered without hesitation, the certainty in her heart stronger than any remaining doubt. "I will honor your teachings, protect your secrets, and defend this community with my life if necessary." "Oh." The head elder nodded slowly, then spoke the words that would transform Rebecca's existence. "Then let it be known that from this night forward, you are no longer Rebecca of the White World. You are Honagahni, one who walks around. You belong to Earth Clan through Nakohe's family line." As Makawi translated this pronouncement, a weight Rebecca hadn't fully acknowledged lifted from her shoulders. She had been given not just a place to stay, but a new identity, a rebirth recognized by the community that had taken her in. "The ceremony begins," the head elder announced, rising from his seat. "Tonight we celebrate balance, light and dark, past and future, ending and beginning." What followed was unlike anything Rebecca, now Honagani, had experienced. The community formed concentric circles around the fire, moving in rhythm to songs that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Elders led prayers in Navajo, their voices blending with the crackling flames and the whisper of wind through canyon walls. Makawi stayed close, guiding Rebecca through the unfamiliar rituals, whispering explanations of symbology and meaning. Certain elements were kept private, Makawi explained, not yet to be shared with even an adopted clan member until proper time had passed and deeper understanding achieved. Throughout the ceremony, Rebecca felt Nakohe's presence nearby, steady and reassuring. When the ritual movements brought them side by side, she spoke softly, for his ears alone. "Thank you for the bracelet. I didn't understand what it meant." His expression remained serene as he watched the ceremonial dances. "You were ready to understand. That is why I gave it." "And if the council had decided differently?" she asked. The corner of his mouth curved slightly. "Then it would have protected you on journey elsewhere. Medicine works many ways." The simple wisdom of this approach, preparing for multiple outcomes while trusting in the right one, struck Rebecca as profoundly characteristic of the man who had saved her life. Always practical, yet guided by deeper principles than mere survival. As the ceremony continued into the night, Rebecca found herself fully participating, not as observer, but as member, accepted, if not yet fully integrated. The rhythms of the songs began to feel familiar, the movements of the dances natural rather than foreign. In the flickering firelight, surrounded by people who had chosen to accept her despite every reason for suspicion, Rebecca felt the last vestiges of her old self falling away. The frightened widow abandoned in the canyon was gone. The woman who emerged from that crucible, stronger, more resilient, connected to land and community in ways she had never imagined possible, was Honarani now, one who walks around. Near dawn, as the ceremony drew to a close and the full moon began its descent, Talon approached with his flute in hand. He nodded toward the instrument Rebecca carried tucked in her belt. "Now we play Sunrise Song," he said, his young face solemn with ceremonial purpose. "Welcome new day." Together, they stood at the eastern edge of the gathering, faces turned toward the lightening horizon. As the first golden rays touched the canyon rim, their flutes gave voice to the moment, high, clear notes that spoke of renewal, of beginnings, of hope after darkness. The community fell silent, listening to the duet that bridged generations and cultures. Rebecca played the melody Talon had taught her, finding that her fingers moved with newfound confidence across the holes, producing tones that blended perfectly with his more practiced ones. When the song ended, Elder Sitala approached, placing weathered hands on Rebecca's shoulders in a gesture of blessing. "Good beginning," she said simply. "Long path ahead." The truth of those words settled in Rebecca's heart as the community dispersed to begin their daily tasks, the ceremony complete, but its effects continuing to resonate. She'd been given a new name, a clan, a place, but true belonging would take more time, more learning, more proving of herself through seasons yet to come. Nakohe joined her as the rising sun cast long shadows across the settlement. "Today, you rest," he said. "Tomorrow, new lessons begin." "What lessons?" Rebecca asked, curious about the path forward now that her immediate future was secured. "Winter comes," he replied practically. "Must learn food storage, cold weather medicine, how to read snow signs." He paused, studying her face in the morning. Light. Also deeper teachings, language, prayers, stories that explain world. The prospect filled her with both anticipation and humility. There was so much to learn, so much she didn't yet understand about the culture that had embraced her. "I won't disappoint you," she promised, "or the council or myself." Nakohe's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Know this already," he said with quiet certainty. "Would not have given bracelet otherwise." As they walked back toward the dwelling they would continue to share, as family now, not rescuer and rescued, Rebecca caught sight of a hawk circling high above the canyon, riding the morning thermals with effortless grace. Weeks ago, she had seen such birds as harbingers of death, patiently waiting for her to surrender to the merciless desert. Now she recognized them differently, as fierce survivors, adaptable hunters, beings who understood their place in the intricate balance of desert life. Not so different, perhaps, from what she was becoming. The woman who had been Rebecca Mitchell looked up at the vast blue sky, then across the settlement that was now her home, and felt something settle into place within her. A belonging that had nothing to do with where she had come from and everything to do with who she had chosen to become. Honarani, one who walks around. The name felt right, a recognition of the journey that had brought her here, and the many journeys yet to come as she learned to walk in this new world, between worlds, around the challenges that life would inevitably present. The canyon that had nearly claimed her life had instead given her a new one, and that perhaps was the greatest lesson of all, that endings and beginnings were often the same moment, viewed from different perspectives. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.